Hey everyone, we just got finished with the coping discussion, and there were some additional questions that we weren't able to get to, so we wanted to answer those now. BJ, the first question is how can we adapt these coping ways to compassion fatigue of healthcare workers?
Mm. Well, starters, let's just acknowledge that I think it's implied on a lot of things we say, but very often the patient is the one we presume needs to be coping. But caregivers, whether family, informal, friends, or us professional clinicians, we're all caregivers too in this writ large, in this big way. Yeah, I think our feelings as the non-patient in the mix often get short shrift. There's not, we have hospitals built for patients, we've got support groups for patients, we've got all sorts of infrastructure. It's incomplete, it's inadequate, but at least there's some sense or some proof that the world is making space for patients. There's not so much proof that the world's making space for caregivers or clinicians in the same way. And so just acknowledging it, and I think it's the first part here, that especially if you're a good clinician, if you're listening, if you are compassionate, if you are empathetic, all traits which make you that are essential to being a good clinician. Well, of course, just to remind ourselves of the math, that means you are feeling their pain, their suffering becomes your own in some real ways. And over the course of a day or a week or a year of that, it adds up fast. So just to state the problem here, and why that can feel extra alienating, because we're not the sick ones, right? So we shouldn't need the help or something like that. So, yeah, but we do. We really, really, really do, especially these days with the pandemic. I feel for our clinician brothers and sisters. Oh my goodness. So back to your question. So that's a sort of setup to the answer, just to make space for it. But I would say anything we discussed today, anything on our incomplete list of coping mechanisms and ways into dealing with reality, are just as relevant to a caregiver, professional or otherwise, as they are to a patient. All of them. This list is about coping with being a human being, really, and that includes feeling a bunch of hard things, even if you're the healthiest person in the world. So yeah, all of the above still work for caregivers, and then beyond that, I think it's on us too to continue to refine the culture of clinical work, to make space for this. We're kind of stuck with an old way of, especially on the medical side, where you're supposed to be these caregiving machines. Like, you're really good at your job, like you don't need to sleep, you just you're just caring for anyone who comes your way. Like that's this sort of weird pathologically altruistic model, the medical model sort of presumes. So yeah, in our individual lives, we need to go home at the end of the day, and we need to find a way to unload, to process. And during our day, we do too. Can't just hold our breath and get through the day. So yes, we need to individually take this on, but more of us need to share the fact that we're struggling, especially people in positions of leadership. If they're owning their own pain and their own struggles, then that helps de-shame it for the youngsters and the trainees coming up who don't absorb this idea that they're supposed to be emotionless and somehow not be hurt. It's impossible to not be hurt and be a thinking, feeling person. So my last comment here, just to summarize and wrap it up, is that we need to also continue to shift the culture in clinical work that acknowledges the caregivers and clinicians are human beings too, and with thoughts and feelings and huge piles of emotion that they take on in any one day. And over time, work this into our curricula, into the esprit de corps of healthcare. We need to encourage each other and take care of ourselves versus making fun of each other for daring to have needs, which is sort of the current mode. So there you go.
The next question comes from someone I think you know. His name is Bruce Miller, and he asks, what role does nature play in coping?
Okay, so Bruce Miller, for anyone listening here, the B in BJ is Bruce. So this is my father, Bruce Sr. We'll call him BS. So sorry, wait, what was Daddy's question?
His question was, what role does nature play in coping?
Oh, great. Thank you, Dad. That's a really good, I think a huge one. It's a great place to go feel things, to let your mind roam, to get creative, to see how nature does it. I think for me, it's a huge piece of how I cope is just being in the natural world. And not as a visitor, ideally, but realizing that I am a part of the natural world. That's so therapeutic for me. So I can look at the trees, I can look at the animals I live with, I can see myself in them and them in me. They have lifespans. They move. They affect things. They are affected by things. In this endlessly churning loop of life and death that's all around us all the time with nature. So nature is sort of a heroic force that is revealing this this basic life and death cycle to us all the time, and is so gorgeous in the process. So we can be inspired by nature. I very much am, and being in it, being in the elements, feeling it, all that's plenty. But the real power comes, I think, from when we turn that corner and see ourselves as part of that nature too. It's another odd Western thing that feels like it's kind of running its course, which was man versus nature, which implies that man is somehow different from nature. Now, human nature is a piece of nature too, and I think that's a really important piece to acknowledge. So getting back to nature doesn't necessarily mean putting on a loincloth and living off seeds outside in the elements all the time. No, building a home, having a job, that's part of nature too. So again, I think the idea here is to see ourselves in this much bigger world and to feel part of that world. And that has a way of right-sizing ourselves, helping us come to terms with just the bare fact that we die, we live, and it all keeps on churning and keep on going. So anyway, I feel I could talk to this one for hours, but I'd probably repeat myself if I kept going. But thank you, Dad, for that question. I really appreciate that.
Okay, the next one is a little bit of an intro and then the question, so I'll read the whole thing here. For me, a practice of gratitude has been an amazing coping mechanism. I frequently find myself recognizing my fortune as it relates to my caregiver, my wonderful wife. I sometimes see her sacrifice suffering, and the fact that she hides her pain is a source of guilt. This guilt
Mm.
can cause me to be less forthcoming about my own difficulties as an attempt to make her life easier. An odd communication gap occurs as I attempt to be less burdensome. How can I be less of a pain in the butt? Great question.
It's a beautiful question and beautifully worded, and hard. I feel you. You know, this comes up a lot. I mean, the number one concern for most patients, and one of the big reasons people want to hasten their own death very often. I'm not kidding. When it comes to that, is because they're feeling like a burden. They need to get out of the way. That they are gumming up the works of life for others. It's really, really tricky. Because part of the truth is you are a burden. It's the wrong word, but you are interdependent is the sweeter way of putting that, which means like we need things from each other. We can't live this life by ourselves. It just can't work. It, we would die within hours. So part of my answer to your big question is less about your dynamic as a couple, but as society, as a people, we have to kind of wrap our heads around not only the naturalness of getting sick, of becoming frail, of dying, of needing each other, of needing help. We need to wrap our heads around that as being part of normal, full, rich life. Because until we make the proper space for all this caring, giving, and receiving, we're just gonna be left feeling like a burden. Because somehow as though illness and dying are somehow anomalous and yanking your wife or you out of normal life, when in fact what you are living is very much a normal life. So I see your question as really it's a challenge to us as we make up our a society, is how do we do justice to this part of our nature, the nature that gets sick, that needs, that dies. And then we won't, then that would obviate the sense that we're a burden. Then you could just feel the sweetness of depending on each other. So that's great. I think we should all work to that world. Please, let's keep sharing, keep talking about it. And sometimes being sick, I've had this as a disabled person, is I've had to just kind of, there have been moments that have been really embarrassing where I've really needed help out in public in various ways. My mother in her wheelchair can't get into certain stores, needs help, and it can feel very embarrassing, like we're imposing on people. But remind yourself, please, that the problem is less in you. The problem is more that we've crafted a world where it feels unokay to need each other. It's a mouthful, but meanwhile, back to your dynamic as a couple. Well, I think naming it might help, and simply saying, "Honey, I know I'm taking from you, and I know this cuts into your life. And if it's too much, let's figure out a way to get help. You don't need to do all this by yourself." That might be a way to kind of unburden her from feeling like she has to do everything. But I'd say just talking about it, naming it. So often I work with families who, like you're feeling a burden and you start trying to protect your spouse. And then the spouse in private moment will come talk to me and say, gosh, I'm feeling like this or that, but I'm trying to protect my loved one, the husband, the patient, from my own needs because he's the sick one. So this loving, protecting each other by curtailing ourselves, that very often you can pierce that by just talking about it in a safe way. Like, honey, let's go for a walk, let's have dinner. I really want to talk to you about this. And just having an ongoing dialogue. And just for all my talk of us needing each other, that doesn't mean it can't be overwhelming and that we don't need help ourselves as caregivers. So I just open that up and see where you can go and dare to get help for her. Again, caregivers need help too. Why? Because they're humans. So I hope that's a helpful answer to your very big and important question.
And that is all the questions we had. So thanks everyone for watching and participating, and we hope that you'll join us in the new year for our next talk in January.
Oh, can I say one more thing?
Of course you can.
That last question, can't remember his name, but
He's nameless.
okay. All right, Mr. Nameless. I guess maybe it was implied in what I just said, but it can go so far is just acknowledging what she's doing for you and thanking her and not just saying, but feeling that gratitude, squeezing her, holding her, say, God, I love you so much. Thank you for doing this. Thank you. Thank you. I see you. I see your pain too. It's very often, I remember in times when I've been very vulnerable myself, I didn't want to see how much pain I was causing people who cared about me. I didn't want to see how my issues spilled over onto them, so I didn't look. And in the end, I wasn't acknowledging what they were doing. So if in case it wasn't explicit, just simply daring to see her struggles, her pain too, and acknowledging them, that can be all that's required. Okay, now I'm really done.
Great. Thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys. See you next time.